so much, Kirsten, for this wonderful introduction. I think it's also interesting that you point out these details about standardization, which are not so much in this current presentation, by the way, but hold on. Not so much in this presentation, but it's yeah, it is a part of my book. So maybe first I should introduce myself, because I'm not sure that all of you are communications design students. Maybe you come from different faculties as well. So my personal background is in graphic design. And after my bachelor studies, I worked for 10 years in different studios. I worked in advertising. I worked for cultural clients. I worked also for governments. So I have a lot of experience working in also as a freelancer. So after that, I did my master's, and I kind of changed my my practice a little bit more towards journalism. And I also started to teach. So I also have 10 years of experience as a teacher in graphic design. And this book basically came from my previous book, which is called The Politics of Design from 2016, where I used that book basically to discuss this idea of neutrality and cultural bias within design. And from that, I also started to question my own practice and how to kind of organize a more ethical and maybe a practice that will be more in line with the climate crisis and what that kind of requires, right? But of course, that is easier said than done. So in order to kind of understand a little bit what I could do, I understood first I needed to understand the complexities of economic relations and graphic design, particularly capitalism. You know, would it even be possible to be a graphic designer in such conditions, or do you just have to completely abandon such a profession, right? So this book took me 3.5 years to write, and it could have also not been made because I started with the idea that it maybe would have been possible, but maybe not. So in the end, I found all these collectives I will talk about in the end that are already doing this kind of design that kind of resists capitalism or tries to kind of organize different, let's say, design practices, different kind of studios that are organized in a more ethical or egalitarian way. And that really gave me a kind of hope to pursue this book. Now, obviously, this topic of economics and capitalism and design is so large that a book about such a topic cannot be exhaustive, right? There will always be like things lacking. So this is why I have this kind of structure that is these 12 chapters. And these are the kind of various ways that a designer would look at the context of economics. So these are not all the roles that designers will play or have to play. It's more that how does somebody who does branding, how do they relate themselves to economics? How does somebody who is a designer but also works for a boss or is also an intern or somebody who is a speculative designer or a social designer? So these kind of like different roles, maybe somebody from advertising, that's maybe some designers will play at some point in their lives. How would that relate to economic relations? And this is kind of a way of navigating such a complex topic without trying to kind of like simplify it necessarily. And of course, I also read a lot of theory, a lot of economic theory. So both this book is really based on my personal experiences working as a designer, but also yeah, from the theory I was using. So I found that the best way to start this book is by thinking a little bit about kind of also the basis of what economy is and how design-related activities are involved there. So I start with a kind of role that is maybe something that happened before design as a term was, let's say, known or used, which is the idea of the scribe, right? So people making books and writing documents by hand. Of course, monks did that, but also before monks, we had scribes, for example, in Mesopotamia. So these are the oldest, let's say the oldest artifacts, the oldest written documents ever found, right? So these are clay tablets from Mesopotamia. They're around, this one is around 9.5 by 7 centimeters. So it's quite small. And this is actually a receipt of beer. And I think what is interesting is that before there was writing, there was already accounting. So this is a form of notation that is about like the storing of a certain material, in this case, beer. But it's not like prose or poetry. You cannot like read it as text. It's basically a kind of numbers But you already see that the scribes here used a kind of methodic kind of mark making, and also they use a kind of grid system. So even though those people were not known as designers, they already did a kind of service creating these documents that would create trust in the economic system, right? So, and I think it's interesting to point out that, so it might actually not be a coincidence that the oldest remaining documents, graphic documents, are actually receipts, are forms of accounting, is because if you have economic relationships in a small community, let's say up to a few hundred people, you can still remember basically economic transactions. So you can still basically organize, and this is what David Graeber talks about in his book about debt. You can still basically organize society by saying, I just borrowed this from this person, I will remember this, or I will just kind of like, make like a little, make like a little knot on my rope, and I will remember it. But once societies grew larger, you also had to trade with people that were strangers, right? And if you trade with a stranger, you cannot trust that person based on the fact that you know them. So you need a kind of graphic document to intermediate that trust. So these documents were basically made to trade with strangers, and the first cities in Mesopotamia were 200,000 large, so there were really large societies, which is why these kind of documents were necessary. So what we see historically as at the moment that economic situation systems start to scale up, design documents start to circulate to kind of, let's say, replace the trust that we usually is based on just social connections, family, friends, knowing each other, etc. Now, if we fast forward to the first banknote in Europe, this is from 1666 in Sweden. This is about A5. These were quite big. We actually see the same kind of logic, right? So the first banknotes were made because coins became so heavy that merchants actually couldn't carry around so many coins. So the banks just said, we'll write a note for you. You can give this note when you make a trade, and then people can come back and pick up the coins. Eventually, people didn't do that. They should start just exchanging these banknotes, literally notes from the bank. So here you also see is the trust instilled that the bank will actually give you these coins if you ask for them, is here instilled through all these kind of graphic means, right? So we see a certain kind of paper, we see like kind of ornamental boundary, of course, using the printing press. We see different typefaces, here typeset with movable type. We also see stamps and autographs. So we see all these kind of graphic techniques used to make sure that we can trust this document and not simply like forgery it, right? And the same kind of logic we see everywhere in society now. We see them in things like your contract. Maybe even we see them in things like passports. We see them in all these kind of graphic documents, in immigration forms, in tax forms. All these documents that are designed in such a way that we trust these documents to be true, that they use a certain kind of typeface, a certain kind of organizing. And those are all the time updated when new technologies become available, right? But their basic function has changed very little actually over time. Now, if we talk a little bit about the communication of economy in general, what of course happened during colonial times is that the complexity of global trade, of course, spearheaded by these kind of Dutch East India and West India companies and these really big colonial multinationals that were basically starting this really big trade, because it was all based on investors, right? Investors. These were the first, basically, multinationals that sold stock to make these really expensive, let's say, colonial conquest possible. And of course, the investors wanted to know if these expensive investments would be paid back. So that's why lists were published in these newspapers, like the Price Current here in Amsterdam from 1636, to show the fluctuation in price of all these commodities that would be traded. Now, if we look at the kind of graphic language, we see it's not actually so much different from a financial newspaper these days, like you see on the right. When you look at, for example, stock market lists, and you see like tabular lining, you see all these numbers like listed. And, when I was working as a graphic designer and I had to work on, let's say, annual reports, I had to do like infographics. I also was completely, convinced that the way to communicate economy is through list of numbers, through infographics, through bar charts to pie charts, because this is what we're used to, right? Now, so what we've created basically is we've created a language, and of course not just graphic designers, but these are graphic languages. These are languages also created by graphic designers. How we communicate economic systems is through this kind of idea of this kind of trading desk, where we see a list of numbers and infographics, which allows a trader to make quick decisions based on profits and losses and kind of like price currents and all these things. But of course, what happens is if we look at the world through the language of mathematics and numbers alone, we miss the kind of social context behind them. So we have to understand behind every number on this screen, there's an actual family with a job, with children, with a house, with a mortgage. Those are loans by people who are trying to start a business. Those are maybe study loans. So all of these numbers are actually, there's stories behind them by humans, right? But because we don't really see those stories, it becomes easier to make quick decisions that might have really devastating consequences. So an example is the 2008 financial crisis. There were a lot of these mortgages from the United States that were being like packaged and sold. And then there were these financial products that would bet against that these mortgages would rise in value or would go down in value. And it became this complete game to guess where these mortgages would go. And people kind of lost the concept of that these mortgages were actually real houses where people were actually living in. So what happened when all these financial products kind of imploded and all these financial corporations went bankrupt is that many people lost their houses. There were complete neighborhoods in the United States where people ended up living on the street. But at the same time, all the houses were empty. And those houses were immediately bought up again by investors because they were, of course, very cheap. And the investors would just keep them empty until their value would rise again. Now, if we would think about like a small society, let's say of 30 or 40 people, that would never happen. You would never, kick everybody out of their homes and then one person would own all of the houses. That would not impossible, would be inhumane. But under capitalism, this is completely normal because the right to housing as a property, the right for the owner of the house to do with the house what they want, even keeping it empty, waiting for the value to rise, is of course covered by law. This is of course completely justified. And this is even regarded more important by law than somebody that needs a roof over their head, for example. So I think it's really important that when we communicate financial information and we think about the role of graphic documents in this idea of the communication of economics, that we also should find ways to kind of link that to the social kind of grounding of economics. And a nice example is this from Gapminder from Sweden. So this is actually a website of different incomes in the world. And you actually see that it's not just the incomes of all these families, but it's also their photos of these families. It's, their dog, you see them cooking. And then you realize it becomes more difficult if you're like a trader to make decisions about people's lives when you actually see who are the people behind those like numbers, right? So I think it's really important. I mean, we still need kind of to communicate complex economic and scientific information using mathematics, obviously, for very practical reasons. But we should also really think about that all these things were essentially once kind of organized in order to make sure that all of us would have enough food to eat and, all of us would be allocated houses to live in, etc. So if those needs are no longer covered and the profits of certain corporations are regarded more important than that, then maybe we should kind of reevaluate the role of this kind of representation. This is like the first chapter in my book. I have like a few other ones that follow on this, and what kind of binds these first 3 chapters together is that they basically all talk about what kind of objects the designers create. So the documents, the contracts, the banknotes, the coins, all these things are design documents, right? But it also talks about things like branding and corporate identities, and maybe things that are maybe a little bit more closer to the work you are doing in school, or at least that I've been doing while I was working. A lot of my work was actually in identity design. You can even argue that a lot of design work today, even UX design, comes from this idea of branding and the marketing that kind of underpins that, right? So if we look a little bit closer at branding, I think it's also good to remember that branding in itself is not necessarily like a really bad thing. You know, already in the Middle Ages, people made, you know, their own shoes, they made their own wine, and they made like a small mark. Maybe it was a family, a kind of like the letters of your family that would be kind of on this product as a kind of form of pride, or maybe it was a guild. But I mean, there's nothing wrong to be proud of like a product that you've been making, right, as a producer. But I mean, those kind of forms of branding were actually very limited. So if you see this kind of the idea of the grocer, which was like, you know, what you had before the supermarket, then you actually see that this is like, let's say, like late 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. You see that most of the things you could buy in the shop are actually not branded. You know, things like flour or corn or you know, these kind of products are sold in big bags, and you can just like scoop that into like a small paper bag or something. Most products would be, let's say, unbranded, like soap. There would be many different kinds of soap, but they would not carry a brand on it. And branding actually started under the pressure of colonialism, because different colonial powers, especially France and the UK, started to with their colonial products, usually made with things like palm oil, they started to kind of like be more competitive in the market. And of course, we know now that, that this is, you know, now we have this kind of like abundance of choice in the supermarket. And this is often considered also a kind of, the victorious, the victory of capitalism, right? Like all this choice. When I go to the supermarket, for example, here in my street, there are 20 different types of peanut butter in the shop, right? Now, I like peanut butter, but it's like a lot of choice for one product like that. So that's kind of the idea, right? Like in Soviet times, there were no products and the shelves were empty, but under capitalism, these are completely full and we have all this kind of abundance of choice. But when we actually look at the kind of structure of these brands, and we see, of course, that most of these products are actually dominated by a handful of companies that have so much influence on the food market that they can both pressure food producers, farmers, but also supermarkets. Those are companies like Nestle, Unilever, PepsiCo, and they even compete within the same product range. So you have the idea, you have the choice between different brands, but they're all from the same company, right? And a lot of these companies are actually rooted in also colonial production, companies like Unilever, of course. So actually, this is the idea of this is all like the abundance of choice. Under that lies actually a monopoly, monopolies by corporations that actually stop and like block a lot of like progress, and that have really strong lobbies at the European Union to prevent like better, you know, food labeling on products, etc. So they have like a lot of influence, let's say, on the supermarket level of branding and the products. And of course, now since the 1990s, branding has even become something else entirely. It hasn't even become something completely separate of the product itself, right? So if you think about mega brands like Nike and Apple, which are the most valuable companies in the world just based on their brand value, they actually don't actually on paper produce any products at all. So these are the biggest companies in the world, the most valuable companies in the world, but they don't actually produce products, because everything that they sell, they buy from subcontractors in low-wage countries. So legally, they don't even produce, you know, these products anymore. And the CEO of Nike already said in the 1990s that he realized that at this moment, when we're outsourcing all this production of shoes to low-wage countries, that we're actually not producing shoes anymore. They are producing images. They were producing a brand. That was the most important thing that these companies were doing. You know, so now this brand has become this kind of religion where, you know, what first started as this kind of idea from the Industrial Revolution, that things that come from that are completely identical and that come from the factory line, a designer was asked to put life into these products, because those products were, of course, lifeless in compared to the handmade products made in the workshop. Designers started to create these like fictions. Oh, this is not just any shoe. This is a Nike shoe. This is an Adidas shoe, etc. And now, of course, this fiction has become even completely disconnected from the production itself, where the brand experience can become something. And we see this, of course, with things like apps and websites and the kind of services that don't even have like a physical product underneath this, that are basically all based around this idea of fiction, right? And I think in that context, this kind of like unlimited reach of branding is also where I think the history of branding, of the origin of the word comes in, which is that branding itself comes from the word brander. This is a word from Norwegian, from Old Norwegian, which is of course about burn mark in the skin of an animal with cattle, but also in Roman times it was also done, for example, with slaves. People were captured as war victims that were actually branded with the currency of the country they were from, so the family could buy them and free them. Under Roman law, it's very important to emphasize that slaves were not humans. Their humanity was basically stripped from them, and they became commodities. They became products that were owned by actually the people who owned the slaves. And this was, of course, on a much larger scale during the colonial times, especially, for example, by the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company, where Simone Brown writes that the Dutch who were actually branding the slaves actually had complete identity manuals to describe what letters had to be used for the branding and how that process would go. Because these companies were also the first multinationals, this also related to the first corporate identities. And I think it's important to remember, and I think this image from this artist from the United States, Hank Willis Thomas, is I think a really interesting connection with this kind of mega brands from the 1990s and this kind of this kind of branding of enslaved peoples. Because of course the whole point is that it's a form of torture. And this torture kind of transforms a human being into a commodity, you know, strips that human being from all their intrinsic rights, but it makes them at least a commodity that can just be traded and sold and even be killed without any repercussions, right? And this kind of process we have also seen in the way that the commons, and the commons are basically, yeah, the things that we all have access to, let's say, clean water, oxygen, you know, going to nature, like all these things that are basically free to an extent, because those things are kind of being more and more taken from our public access. But this idea that graphic design and branding has the power to do this, right? And this is, I think, a good example. These are 3 bottles of water, the most expensive bottles that I could find. Now, if I would say, if you go to the Eiffel and you put some of this delicious water into a plastic bottle, people are not going to pay a lot of money for it. So what you need to do is you need to not only find this water, but you also need to design this kind of bottle and create this narrative around this bottle. And I think all the graphic designers kind of understand, and the product designers understand this logic, that ask a designer if they can, you know, design a water bottle that be able to sell something that should be a basic human right. It should be almost for free for 290 euros for a small bottle. And a graphic designer or a product designer is a person who can do that, right? This is the kind of things that we are good at doing, making something that has no value from its own, or no monetary value, and kind of create a monetary value out of that. So this is also why this famous quote by the CEO of Nestle, that he does not believe that water is a human right, but it's a product. This is why this is also so related to this idea of branding. Another example are of course cities. City branding is also very important to understand that these are not just logos that are made to make their citizen proud, because, for example, I Amsterdam and B Berlin are both in English. But the people who live in those cities don't speak English, because those logos are not made for the citizens in those cities. Those logos are part of a marketing campaign to sell the city. And how do they sell the city? I Amsterdam, this campaign very specifically did that by making websites specifically meant for foreign real estate investors to invite people, wealthy people from around the world, to start buying up real estate in a city like Amsterdam, but also in Berlin, and also inviting rich tourists to bring more money to the city. So what happens in this process is where all this real estate is bought up, companies like Airbnb come in. And what happened in the Netherlands since this advertising campaign came about is we have a doubling in homelessness, and the city has become now so unaffordable that me teaching at an art school in the Netherlands can actually not afford to live in Amsterdam. I would not be able to buy a house. The only reason I can still live in Amsterdam, and I do, is because I have a rent, the same apartment for 70 years, which is like limited by rent. So the city would even not be even affordable for the same designers anymore who have created actually these brands in the first place. You know, so this is the kind of the central contradiction of this kind of capitalism, where it's kind of meant to create this perfect demand, this perfect equilibrium, you know, between supply and demand. But what actually happens with something like housing, which is scarce, you actually see that money from all over the world, the wealthiest people, come in and buy up homes in places like Amsterdam and Berlin, and then make it, for example, completely impossible for working class people in those same cities to even live in the city they were actually born and raised in. You know, and the fact that we have a doubling homelessness in the last 10 years in Amsterdam, which is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, is, I think, a really good example how this system does not work. It only works for a few people who are becoming very wealthy from real estate, but yeah, for many others, it just becomes simply too unaffordable. So yeah, we should really kind of navigate what things in society should be sold, what should be markets, and what things should be restricted and not should be markets at all, but maybe should be a human right, for example. So the second part of my book is not about the work that designers do, but how they work. So this is something that's usually not discussed in design books. In design books, we usually talk about the objects that designers make. But we rarely talk about unpaid internships. We rarely talk about design work, working at a studio, working long hours, working nights, what kind of jobs, what kind of freelance hourly rates can you ask? So all these kind of like things come up in this second part of my book. Now, it's important to remind ourselves that graphic design actually until the 1900s was basically a working class job. You could not like learn it in school. There were no books that you could learn graphic design from. You would learn it in the workshop. This was, of course, in this kind of idea of the guild context, where it was usually based on a kind of family organization or a very close organization, where the production and the design of all these things, in this case of a book, would happen under the same roof. Sometimes even paper making, lithography, typesetting, type cutting, writing, all happened under the same roof. And there were all these roles like journeyman and in the workshop master that would take a certain amount of time to learn these crafts, but these would all be learned within the same kind of context. So let's say design and production were exactly the same thing, right? They were the same kind of profession. Now, of course, what happened with the Industrial Revolution is that a lot of these machines became so big and so dangerous, and especially with the steam engine, these kind of like textile machines, they were so dangerous that the people who were actually designing for these products were actually moved to a different, they were actually created a new class that were in between the factory, the people in the factory, and between the factory bosses, right? And these were the white collar workers. These were the designers, the salespeople, the clerks. So the factory floors were basically a working class floor, which would be dirty and that would be dangerous. And above that, within the same factory would be, or in another building would be the designers. And the designers would be, like I said, asked to create the stories and the fictions of the products that were created actually in the factories. You know, so if the factory created shoes, for example, now in the workshop, the shoe and the story of the shoe were, of course, created in the same place. You know, the shoe was made and that was sold to somebody in the same place where the shoe was actually created. But shoes that came from the factory, that was basically like a steam-powered factory. People, of course, could not go to the factory floor. It was too dangerous. It was also not a pleasant sight to see. Working conditions were really horrible. So there were special shops, and those were created by people who studied marketing, studied advertising, and created these kind of fictions. This is this kind of shoe with this kind of name, and this is when the first kind of branding and, you know, design-related activities started to appear. And now, of course, today, and especially with fashion and product design, that we see that the production is not even, you know, close anymore. We are not even close to the factory often, but the production even happens on the other side of the world. You know, the production of most products and of most fashion that we wear, or most clothes that we wear, happens in low-wage countries like in Southeast Asia. So that design today becomes much more a kind of like activity that is not limited anymore by production. So that means that work can go on 24/7. because yeah, especially if you create digital products like websites or apps, yeah, I mean, there can be an update at any moment, so there's basically no reason to stop production. So that means that the design can never go faster and faster, right? And this also has created a very difficult relationship for designers as well, which are, of course, in some way a privileged class. You know, many people say you do it because you like it. Graphic design is your passion. You must be so happy that you can create a job out of your hobby, right? But it also has created this kind of like environment where a lot of professional designers are saying, no, it's good to work really hard, to work in the evenings, to work in the weekends. And this is what you have to do to, you know, to get ahead and become famous and become a good designer. But of course, not everybody can be a famous designer. Not everybody can do their wonderful work for this great museum that everybody wants to do. Not everybody can have their solo exhibition. So many people are also just working at big design studios, making banners, making UX designs, doing all these details, which is a lot of hard work. And this has created kind of unhealthy relationship to work, right? So many designers, they work more than 40 hours. Many work late nights. Many suffer from things like depression and burnouts. So we're also kind of like creating out of this kind of story of that we all, you know, we can all be famous. We can all be this entrepreneur. And we can all be this kind of like designer who does these exhibitions at these amazing museums and work for these great clients, has created this idea that we all have to work really hard, and that is not necessarily a very healthy relationship to work. For example, this is a book that is given to people that work at Facebook that says the quick shall inherit the earth. And this is what I was talking about digital production, because those who can ship quickly can improve quickly, right? There's never, you know, there's never a limit to how fast you can work in this kind of, you know, day and age of like publishing on Instagram and publishing like on online. So when it used to be that there were 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and eight hours for do what you want, you know, now we have to, you know, be available via email. We have to be available via chat. We have to update our Instagram. We have to update our Behance. We have to get new courses in programming. We have to do new courses in animation, because there's always a new kind of software platform out there we don't know yet. So the pressure on designers and also on young designers today is, I think, very, very high. And this is all based on this kind of capitalist notion that if you only work hard enough, you know, you can make it. You can become wealthy too. You can become famous too. But the point is that this idea of the entrepreneur and this idea that everybody can be successful is just simply not true. So these are the most valuable 500 companies in the United States. So these are, and of the 500 CEOs, there are as many women as there are named John. So this is something by the New York Times, and you see that all of them, you know, are also have a white skin, you know. So this is like a very, you know, this is not like that everybody can become wealthy and everybody can become successful. Now we actually see that, and we see this in design conferences too, that even though that 60% of design students in many schools in the Netherlands are, for example, women, in design conference we see actually a lot more men than women, although this is actually improving somewhat. So actually the chances of success under capitalism are more influenced by who your parents know, how much money they have, which school that you go to, and what kind of connections you have than, you know, than just on the basis of how smart you are or how hard you want to work. And I think with this, it's also really important to point out that usually this idea of domestic and reproductive labor is not mentioned when we talk about work. When we talk about work, what we mean is people who go to a job and get a paycheck for that job. But there's a lot of work in society. If people wouldn't do that, society would completely collapse, like raising children, cooking food, cleaning houses, taking care of the sick and the elderly, community organizing, political organizing. So all these kind of things that are not considered work, they're actually unvalued. And as this work from 1975 by the Red Women's Workshop from the UK shows, this is work that has historically also mostly done by women. So a lot of this kind of work by women has actually been unpaid, has actually been, society have kind of said, no, women have to do that. So in order for the man to be able to work, the man to be able to go to a work and create this kind of capitalist idea of work that creates a profit. And what's more important, that all of these activities are also not mentioned in the GDP. So if we measure economic production, if we say there's economic growth or there's an economic crisis, we actually don't look at all these economic activities on which all of society depends, like raising children, cooking food, cleaning houses, and all these kind of social activities. We only look at what kind of work creates actually money and is done for corporations and for companies, right? So we have a very kind of, I think, a misconstrued idea of like what creates value in society and what is considered work in society. Now, if we go back to this idea of, you know, this kind of hard work, and that a lot of designers are also complaining about working hard, it's also a problem that necessarily all this hard work has not really been going to only to designers. So this is a graph from the United States, but this can also, to some extent, is also applicable to Europe, where we see that the productivity, so how much people produce every hour or every day, right? People who work, has actually gone up steadily since 1948 until today. But the compensation, so the amount of money that somebody is being paid every hour or every day, was actually going parallel to that until 1973. And then we see this advent of neoliberalism, right? We see that a lot of production, a lot of low-wage work was actually moved to low-wage countries. And what happened through that is that the power of a lot of unions became more difficult because unions actually represented a lot of people who were unemployed. And at the same time, there was this kind of push for neoliberal politics from people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan that actively also broke unions and actually convinced also the audience that it was really bad for the economy, and it was good to actually move factories to other places and actually get rid of a lot of jobs. So what we actually see is that since 1973, people have been working harder and have been working more, as they have always done, but compensation have kind of plateaued. Now, what this kind of has done is that where all this work has gone to is we see this in the way that people have been paid compared to the CEOs. So this is for US capitalism, and this is for the United States. So we see that in 1965, there was a 20-to-1 ratio that every worker gets paid and the CEO gets paid on average 20 times as much. But now it's 320-to-1. So we see that all of this extra work that people have been doing but not getting paid for has actually gone to a very small amount of people who are becoming more and more wealthy. And we'll see that a bit later with this kind of rising inequality that we've seen. So I think a very important thing about this particular story is that it's really important. Look, it's fine to work hard, and it's also great if you love your job, but work shouldn't be like a goal in itself. You know, work is only a way for us to do the things we want in life, right? And there's many types of work that can be very rewarding and very amazing, but cannot be, that are unpaid, for example. So I think it's also important to kind of think about the design industry, not in terms of competition, but in terms of care. You know, that we are not each other's competitors all the time, but we also should be a little bit more mindful of creating kind of a better working condition, let's say together, rather than always trying to kind of compete for one another, because sooner or later jobs, also design jobs, will be automated or will be moved to low-wage countries if that opportunity arises. And that's already happening in online services like Fiverr, where you can just have like somebody make a logo for you for like €5, let's say. You know, so work doesn't have to be like this. You know, we spend more of our waking time with our colleagues and with our family, so why not spend it in a more enjoyable manner? So one more chapter I want to discuss is this idea of the designer as a philanthropist, which relates a little bit to this idea of social design. But maybe I should, let me see if we have time for that. I'll try to do this. Yeah, I think we'll try to do this. I think social design is kind of interesting in that respect, because this part of the book is a little bit about the kind of systems and the kind of ideas that have come from the designer's critique on capitalism. Of course, since the beginning of the design profession, with people like William Morris, but also with people like Victor Papanek that have already critiqued capitalism a lot, and that has been reoccurring throughout the decades. And one of those things was, of course, this book, Design for the Real World by Victor Papanek, which I think is a really important and amazing book, with a very harsh critique on designers' role. Basically, he's saying designers are mostly creating, luxury products for the 1%. Why are we not helping the other 70–80% of society who is basically not helped by most design? And so he worked a lot with the United Nations and with NGOs. Now, in his time, this was a very radical, I think, a radical proposition. He famously went to design school, and he was basically left out of the room because they thought his designs were ugly. He was trying to make this really cheap radio for the third world, but they just thought it was, the wrong color or something. So it's really important that in his time, he was really kicked out of industrial design associations, and this kind of critique was really not actually appreciated. So it was really important that he made this kind of like bold claim that designers can do a lot more than just create, products for capitalist profit. But at the same time, kind of this idea of the designer from Europe or from the United States going to a third world country and creating kind of this, designs for good, also, of course, relates to this kind of idea of the missionary. This idea that, and this was an idea that was really important during colonial times, where all these horrible activities of the colonizers, which were exploitation, which were enslavement, which were extraction of resources and the pillaging of lands, was actually defended by this idea. Now we're bringing religion, and we're bringing also a civilization to this kind of people. This was even called the white man's burden by Kipling. And I think that a lot of this kind of social design activities today are still kind of informed by this relationship, that there's this kind of idea that people have from affluent countries, that they have the kind of moral obligation to help people from poorer countries or even from poorer neighborhoods. And that can be in itself not necessarily a bad thing, but I want to explore a little bit how that can play out in design. Because today what actually happens is this kind of charity model is really become quite important, because we have a lot of these really wealthy billionaires, like Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook in this case. They try to do everything not to pay taxes. They pay a lot less taxes than the average people doing a factory job, for example, but because they believe that they are better in spending their money than governments are, because they don't believe in taxes. And this idea of the charity model is problematic, because the charity model automatically assumes that rich people are inherently better and more moral than poor people, because this is why they deserve to be on top, and they deserve to be the ones, coming up with ideas how to spend that money. And we see that a little bit in the form of these kind of design challenges and this kind of social design for good. This is one from the Netherlands called What Design Can Do. This was a design festival from 2014, where designers from all over the world were invited to create solutions for the influx of Syrian refugees in Europe, right? Now, this must all been quite well known to you in Germany. There was a lot of discussion and debate, and the idea was, designers should do something to help refugees. Now, of course, in itself, this is, of course, a very admirable and kind of good intention. But it's not about the intention here. It's more a little bit about the process of framing, something that is, of course, a political and socio-economic disaster, and how that is framed as a design challenge, as a design brief. Because on the website, to make it easier for designers, and almost I think 800 designs were sent into this challenge, so it was quite successful in that sense. That the idea of the problem of refugees was actually kind of really put in this kind of boxes of you can create an app to help refugees communicate in their new country. You can create a shelter for where refugees can stay. You can come up with a campaign so refugees are better understood by the people in home countries. So all these kind of design briefs, as you would kind of imagine them. But so these are some of the examples. So from those kind of, I think, 635 designs, 20 were selected as runner-ups, and I will discuss a few of them. And these were the 20 best of those 635, right? So this was a designer, an architect from the United States, who wanted to help actually refugees. Also, he wanted to solve the desertification in the south of Europe, especially in Spain and Italy. So his idea was to send all the Syrian refugees to work camps in these kind of desert areas, have them work the land until the land was arable again, and then European farmers could come in and take the land, and then the refugees would go to like a different, a different area. So I mean, for me, this kind of sounds like gulag work camps, like forced labor camps, refugees that can come from any kind of class of society. They can be designers themselves or architects or whatever. It doesn't matter. Like, why should you force people to work in the desert and do this kind of jobs? So for me, that doesn't really sound like a kind of plan that will actually help refugees. But it was still, selected as one of the 20 best ideas. This is one from the Netherlands, where they kind of wanted this TV show to give a better impression of refugees, called Refugees Got Talent, where refugees can kind of show off their talents by singing or dancing or whatnot, or doing stand-up comedy. So this was also selected as one of the 20 best. I mean, for me, it's also kind of like a racist proposition, because there's already Holland's Got Talent. So why can't refugees just, compete there, so to create like a different category for refugees makes them already a kind of a different category of humans. But also the idea that refugees actually want to do that when they come from a system of trauma and war to kind of like perform for on TV is, I think, kind of insulting, actually. So now these are not, these are of course some of the worst ones from these 20. There were still some I think that are quite, that at least try to have jobs for refugees. But this also goes to show that it's not enough to say, designers are going to save the world, because designers, when they're actually not really thinking about the social conditions and circumstances around these topics, can actually end up, making designs that are actually more harmful than do good. Because we should also be reminded that the European Union and the refugee crisis is already very much designed through Fortress Europe, through all the the drones and the surveillance cameras and the fences and this kind of border systems that are actually designed in Europe in cities like Leiden, where the Dutch university is actually actively building this kind of surveillance, designing this kind of surveillance systems to keep refugees out of Europe. So I would argue that the refugee crisis is actually already very much designed, but this part of the refugee crisis is 15 billion, and has cost the lives of more than 12,019 people during 2015 and 2017. We know all this kind of network of prison camps where refugees are kept in Europe, which also people are making a huge profit of. So, I mean, I think this refugee challenge offers more a kind of opportunity for governments in Europe to kind of give this idea that, we're actually being very humane and we're actually doing these very amazing things for refugees. Well, in fact, most of the money and most of the efforts in Europe are actually used to keep refugees actually out of Europe. So I think it's really important as a designer, if you're involved in this kind of humanitarian issues, that you really you really familiarize yourself with the political and social context of these issues. So there are also, if you as a designer want to do something for society, if you want to help other people, there are like better ways of doing that. One thing is called mutual aid. Mutual aid is a concept from anarchism, but it's actually very old. It's just basically the idea of people helping each other. This is basically, you help, in your own neighborhood, in your own street, you help your own peers, you help your fellow students, you help your fellow colleagues. That you shouldn't maybe necessarily look out to help a group that is so far away from you that you cannot really understand the context. A great example is the Black Panthers, that they organized in the 1970s in their own communities a breakfast program, because the United States government was actually not helping these communities. Children would go to school without breakfast. They would not be served breakfast at these schools because of budget cuts. So the Black Panthers would just organize themselves and in their own neighborhoods feed all these children. I think at one point it was over 20,000 children every day. So it was a huge success. During COVID, there were a lot of mutual aid projects, people helping each other, doing groceries for each other. So when you really want to help people with your design, maybe first think about what you can do, let's say in your own neighborhood. How can you help your neighbors, your friends, your family? Because that is a lot more like a better way to help people because it's reciprocal. It's not just the designer helping others, but it's also other people can also help you as well. So there's not this kind of power relation that's what we see with charity, where a rich person or a person that has a kind of position of privilege is helping people who don't have this position of privilege, basically. So I mean, maybe that can help a little bit navigate you if you're interested in doing work like this. So now I've already been talking for quite a while, so I'm going to skip this chapter about speculative design for another time. Because I just want to end a little bit with those examples of these amazing collectives that I have interviewed with my book and I end with. And this chapter is also a little bit about my personal kind of, let's say, drive to write this book. Because this book is not just about, shaming other designers or saying design is bad. I still work as a designer. I still think design can have a role in society. I think design has always existed and will always exist in some way. We will always need visual communication, right? But I think that the way we do it now and the skill we do it now is just not in par with where we need to go with society, because we have a big problem with inequality. We have 2,000 billionaires who have more wealth than 60% of the world's population combined. Also during COVID, this has really extremely also increased, right? These few billionaires who have like so much more money than most of us, really also plummeted with the Silicon Valley billionaires. And because we still have almost 700 million people who go hungry on a daily basis. We have enough food in the world to feed everyone. We just choose not to share it equally. We have enough money in the world to share equally. We just choose not to share it equally, right? And also the amount of people going hungry are actually growing since 2014. And we also have very unequal access to basic things like the internet. 40% of the people does not have access to the internet. And even with terms of something like flying, something that people in Europe are maybe used to doing, every year, 80% of the world has never flown in an airplane. It's important to realize this kind of discrepancies, right? And most importantly, we have the climate crisis that we are now faced with. We have for a very long time, but still the IPCC report came out last week with new alarming figures that we're still not doing enough. Despite all the promises with every climate summit, CO2 emissions are still going up. We're still not doing our best. We're still not curbing fossil fuels. So business as usual, whether it's design or whether it's any other kind of profession, is just not an option, right? But what tends to happen is that companies try to, give themselves like a better image actually using design. They actually ask a graphic designer, can you make our company look more, more queer friendly, more climate friendly, or more friendly towards, let's say, anti-racism. So we see a lot of this kind of greenwashing, pinkwashing, and cost-washing going on, because that's the cheapest thing you can do, is not change anything about your company, not change any of the way you make money, or not change the staff that runs in your company, just create like a new flyer or a new poster. So I think it's also, for the first thing I would say is very important that as designers that our skills are not abused to kind of paint a more ethical picture of capitalism that is actually going on. Because there's actually things that we can do. There's actually things that designers can do and that people can do that work for companies. Unionizing, this is something that has been, let's say, unions have had a bad, reputation, but they are on the rise again, especially, for example, in the US now, we have the Alphabet Workers Union. The people who work at Google have started a union. People at Amazon actually last week started a union. This is a graphic design union from the UK called the Designers and Cultural Workers Union that also invites freelancers. The point is, if we want to end things like unpaid internships or even unpaid speculative work, like unpaid pitches, that happens a lot in the Netherlands, we have to organize. We have to get together with designers. We have to agree that we should all be paid this amount of money. We should refuse this kind of work. We refuse to work for fossil fuel companies, refuse to work for these kind of unethical companies. We can only do that if we join together, and if we're with enough, then yeah, those companies will have no choice than to change their behavior, right? So getting together with other designers and is basically the only way to create a better working position for all of us. Another interesting way is a cooperative or cooperative, if it's run according to these kind of 7 principles. So a cooperative or a cooperative is basically just a business without bosses, right? So basically everybody is involved in decision making and everybody is reimbursed equally, right? So the amount of money you get is the amount of time you put into the cooperative. Now, cooperative is not necessarily like some kind of magic formula that will create like a better and ethical working conditions, because there can be many different ways of power abuse, including things like patriarchy. But at least you don't have this kind of pyramid where you have one boss that makes all the money, and then the managers and the senior designers and the junior designers, and then the interns and etc. Where everybody's trying to kind of like exploit the person that is in the class below them. Now, these cooperatives and these collectives that I interviewed from all over the world actually have been doing this very successfully for actually many years. And I think their experience are really valuable for us to kind of think a little bit about what we can do on the short term and the long term. So this is, for example, Cooperativa de Diseño from Buenos Aires. They're a collective from Argentina. They're a feminist collective that do a lot for the women's movement and for this kind of struggles in this kind of feminist struggles in Latin America, but they also work inside of this factory that was actually taken over by workers in the 1990s. So it's a metal factory that is now collectivized, and they work together with them. So cooperatives also allow you to make connection with other cooperatives and to kind of create like a new kind of economic structure where you only work with other cooperatives trying to kind of subvert economic capitalist exploitation. Common Knowledge is a cooperative from the UK that they are a cooperative that only works with digital platforms, which is really amazing. So they create all these websites and all these kind of back-end systems to help, let's say, activist organizations kind of expand their base. Activist organizations usually are focused a lot on posters and kind of direct flyering, but yeah, internet can be a very good way to kind of mobilize people, but also for different ways of, let's say, collecting information. Like this one is about rent during COVID, the right website, where you could fill in complaints about your landlord, basically. Open source publishing is, I think, really amazing. This collective from Brussels, they already for 15 years only work with open source software. So they don't use macOS, they don't use Adobe Creative Suite, they only use open source software, and everything they do is also licensed under copyleft. So everything that they make, you can download, you can use, you can reuse, you can basically tweak. They put a lot of their typefaces online for free, and all of them, because they believe culture is really created collectively. They also put all of the sketches, all of their design processes online as well. So it's really interesting that you can follow the whole design process on their website. Brave New Alps from the north of Italy is quite interesting. They did a PhD at RCA in London after doing their graphic design BA. Their PhD was actually about capitalism and graphic design, very much related to the kind of things I'm discussing in the book. So they were kind of figuring out how to do a more ethical practice, and then they realized they cannot do that by staying in London because London was simply too unaffordable. You know, if they would stay in London, and that goes for a lot of cities that are just too expensive, you just have to have a commercial job and work for a multinational, or work at a job you don't want. So they actually moved to the countryside in Italy, where their parents are from, decided to live very cheaply, to share all their resources with their community, and also to start to create a kind of solidarity economy. Solidarity economy is a way to think about, okay, if I'm a design studio, I'm spending money and I'm making money, right? But if I spend that money in my own community, and if I make money in my community, then we keep that value in the community. And this is a way of kind of creating a more resilient economic structure in your kind of immediate environment, where you can really help the people that you live together with. And that will also allow you to spend less money, because a lot of less money is taken from multinationals and corporations who just take it for profit. So they really also share, for example, they have a resale printer that they share in their community. They have all these power tools that people in the community can use. So this is actually a way of running a design studio without needing so much money, you know, without, you can actually make a lot less money and therefore live also more comfortably, work less hard and all these kind of things, and create like a better way of life. Lastly, the public from Toronto, this is a community design studio. They came to this neighborhood in Toronto, and they were like, we're going to bring, you know, community design to this neighborhood. But then they realized, yeah, but there's already, you know, creativity in this neighborhood. There's design and creativity in every neighborhood in the world. So maybe we should be more focused on facilitating other people's creativity and helping other people to develop their own creativity, rather than to say we own the right to creativity. So they've actually transformed a little bit more into a social center, where they do a lot of workshops, they facilitate a lot of creativity, they join a lot of neighborhood, let's say, initiatives. And you see their building on the left here, that they, in the bottom of their building, they have like, they have this gallery where people in the neighborhood can exhibit their work, for example. And what I also really appreciate, they really understand how designers are also involved in gentrification, right? Designers go into a neighborhood, they bring other people, they create galleries, the neighborhood becomes more popular, and then poor people are pushed out in the neighborhood and replaced with wealthy people. And then this is the process of gentrification that designers and artists are, yeah, also involved in many cases. So they decided to really actively work against that by also saying, we're going to stay in this neighborhood. We're not just moving there because it's cheap now and it's cool. No, we're here to stay. We're part of this community. We're going to stay here indefinitely. And I think that's also a very amazing, I kind of think to do that. As a designer, you have a social role. You have an economic role in your neighborhood, in your community, and you can choose to like ignore that role, but you can also choose to see that role as a social role and kind of enhance that role with your work. So that also shows me a little bit that this kind of ethical practice is not just about, oh, what kind of posters are you making, what kind of colors and typefaces are you using, but mostly about the social and economic role you have as a designer in your community, with the printers you work with the other producers and the other people you work with locally, and how you create a kind of local economy using those kind of, yeah, using those kind of relations. Anyway, I've talked already quite a lot, so I'm going to leave it at this. Yeah, you can find information about my work and about my book on these channels. And yeah, I hope you really enjoyed it. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Let's see. Yeah. And thank you for listening.